So, Jim, I'll cut to the chase because we don't have much time. The lack of clear consent regime, is it fair to point to that as probably the major barricade now to the development of offshore renewable energy?
I think from my perspective, there are two major and one minor limiting factors to medium and long-term development of offshore in Ireland. I think very quickly, in terms of our national 2030 targets or where they're likely to fall, we won't get within an ass's roar of those unless we have somewhere between 2 and 2.5 gigawatts of offshore renewable electricity, which will largely come from offshore wind. We simply run out spatially and socially of the type of sites we need onshore for onshore wind, and solar PV just takes up too much space. So we need offshore wind, and the cost curves are suggesting that we can do that. I think as you look specifically at Ireland, what Jill said was telling. Even in favourable regimes, it takes about 6 years, 5 to 6 years to develop one of these projects from concept stage. Even if you take the middle ground, it might be 7 or 8 years. Without certainty around the development process here and licensing and consenting, we hit a point of not no return, but a point of difficulty somewhere in the mid-20s. So just as we start running out of onshore land to develop onshore wind on in the mid-2020s, unless we sort out now our licensing consenting system, we lose that timeline. And we very quickly get towards the very end of the 2020s where we need to meet our targets. The second piece is around incentivization. Sure, the cost curves are coming down. The Irish regime right now won't allow an auction price of 0 as it currently stands. Simply won't come through. So I think we need to seriously consider that. And there could be a number of options around that, and we'll soon find out what the support's going to be.
In terms of the consent regime, did you take any hope at all from what the Minister said?
I did. I think in some of the consultation there was an acknowledgement that diversity in Ireland's renewable electricity supply will form a part of it. Now, whether that's different pots, whereas the capping of specific technology types remains to be seen, but I think there must be some acknowledgement of the need for diversity, particularly, again, where you consider the timeline and the pipeline that these projects take. So I take some hope, but again, cabinet decision required.
Yeah, but they really need to get a move on. Yeah. Okay, Luke, can I throw the next one to you? The opportunities for investment in this sector, there are real opportunities. But I presume we're having to think about exporting this sort of offshore renewable energy if it's to justify the investment.
I think when we talk about even the investment opportunities, there's the export piece, but there's also kind of the domestic piece as well, which is quite important. That if we're to be serious about our decarbonisation targets and to transition to a low carbon economy, it has to be underpinned by kind of a renewable wind. A kind of onshore at the minute is more cost effective, but we know it has a natural ceiling. The points already alluded to, kind of this kind of planning challenges, the limited availability of actually viable sites, and now the quickly changing cost and abatement dynamics of offshore technology. But I think a lot of the focus is, unfortunately, we're missing our 2020 targets. We're not on the right trajectory to 2030. But I think we need to throw in another timeline, and that's 2050. Because, we don't have explicit targets, but the EU has for a long time said that by 2050 we need to be a low carbon economy. 80 to 95% emissions reductions by that stage. In Ireland, despite our short-term challenges, we also have those aspirations of 80% reduction. So while the policymakers now look at solutions for the kind of 2020, 2030 scenario, they should be bearing in mind, actually, are these decisions going to put us on a pathway to 2050? And what we need to see is, and we did some work in PwC, is that we actually looked out to that 2050 time horizon. And we wanted to see how we can enable a low carbon energy system, and we looked at all of the available least cost solutions. And what it clearly shows is that wind is the key provider of getting us to that opportunity. By 2030 we need to see an extra kind of 3 gigawatts on the system. By 2050, to address demand, we need to see gigawatt capacity of maybe 9.4%. So that shows that just the domestic situation requires investment from the kind of the developers and the sector. So I think the recurrent theme here then is, for the investors, how do we actually help them to implement that process? And I think a key issue is that we need to, and these are suggestions maybe for the policymakers, is we need to provide a roadmap for both onshore and offshore we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we've maxed out our onshore capacity and then suddenly realize now we need offshore to come online. We need to be developing them both in parallel. And I think what I took a recurrent theme from the fellow panelists is that we need a range of policy solutions, but we need these policy solutions to actually appear in tandem and in parallel. We need to see our energy policy integrated and implemented with regulation, with infrastructure decisions, with investment decisions, that we need a holistic approach if we are to actually enable investors to get a return on their investment and actually help Ireland domestically comply with our challenges, move to a low carbon economy, but also maximise big export potential as well.
A quick point then, Jim, to you again. If we're talking about needing to export the offshore energy that's created, if that's the only way it's going to make sense financially, what situation is the grid in? Can it carry it? What do we need to do with the grid?
So I think at the scale of project that we're generally talking about that becomes economic, it would be hard to fully land all of that power to an Irish demand, let's say, even if you're talking about bringing it to the west coast and across to the east coast where the majority of demand is. Where that's the case, there have already been studies on meshed grids, on interconnection around Ireland that would facilitate that scale of project. And it wouldn't be a project to export our electricity. It would be a project that helps Ireland meet its ambitions with the excess going somewhere else so that it's investable. And it's a very important distinction that needs to be made because our 2030, 2040, 2050 targets should not be the limit of our ambition. If we put the right licensing, consenting and policy frameworks in place, people will invest because it's a good use of capital. And if we can get those building blocks right, it will happen. But at the scale we're talking about, it will help us meet our ambitions, but there will be excess, and we need to prepare for that to make the project investable.
Jill, I mean, is Ireland, from your point of view, a likely place to invest?
Ireland is a very attractive place to invest. As I say, it's got what are probably some of the best wind resources in Europe. There are elements that need to be progressed along, planning, consenting, support to some degree. They are required, and it's about getting them right. I will say I don't envy the minister in any way in his position on trying to get all of this moving forward. It's a very complex and very challenging piece. And we need to do it right. We need to get it right, but we also need to get it done quickly. As I say, 2030 is not that far away. So there are a few things that need to be put in place first before I think we'll be able to get projects kind of going. But Ireland is a hugely attractive place from an offshore wind perspective. As I say, it's got possibly some of the best wind resources in the world.
And Paul Doherty, in terms of the jobs that might come from the offshore renewable energy investment being brought here, will it be, do you think, in the construction of these sort of floating or fixed installations, or will it be from the supporting maintenance, whatever sort of backup jobs?
I think it'll be mixed. I was chatting to my cousin the other day about the scale of the opportunity here.
Yeah.
And we were actually talking about resource at the time rather than supply chain. And he likened offshore wind to the gold rush in the US. And I think it's not a bad analogy in terms of resource, but if you also think about the gold rush in the US and who really capitalized on that opportunity, yes, there was prospectors, yes, there was developers, but there was a lot of people selling shovels. And offshore wind are complex and challenging projects, and they need a lot of shovels in order to get the jobs done. So I think the supply chain for offshore wind on any given project will be hundreds, if not thousands, of different entities all supplying in to make the projects a reality. So from an Irish context, we are an island nation. We have a massive coastline. We have a strong fisheries background. We have a strong aquaculture background. We have a strong shipping background. All of those skills are directly applicable to offshore wind. And then we also have a number of transferable skills and a number of indirect opportunities that we can bring to offshore wind. And like if I take my generation and a lot of my peers, they, in the height of the recession, left the country and found opportunities elsewhere. They were looking for complex projects and challenging projects all across the world. And they're out there working on offshore wind at the moment. Ireland just isn't seeing the benefit of their skills. So I think by creating an industry here, you will also create a reason for a lot of those people to come home. That's just a side benefit.
Marion, I'm going to give you the last words, and generally your view of the real benefits for Ireland in the offshore renewable sector in terms of jobs and energy opportunities and the whole business of CO2 emissions.
Yeah, so I think in the very short term, we're looking at 2020 targets, missing targets, hitting fines. I suppose if we look, we talked about consenting regimes. There are some projects, including our own, which are consented and are ready to go. So this can be a very short-term opportunity to avoid those fines, to kickstart things to 2030. I suppose in our office, there's already people working in offshore wind. There's already jobs. And the scale of CO2 emissions is huge. And also once we decarbonise our electricity, we can use that to power our cars, to power our heating, and really create huge benefits for Ireland overall. So huge.
It's been a little bit like being in a windmill up here, you know, with this constant sound. So listen, thank you very much to our panel. They're going to kick us out now in a moment. But before they do you want to say something, Jim?
Just a final word. We do tend to focus on the challenges and the barriers and the things that are in our way because we're rushing towards the opportunity. It is a massive opportunity that we have. We will definitely access it. There is enough space out there that we can do that in a way that's economically, socially, and very importantly, environmentally sustainable. We should be able to do this in a responsible way if we work together to get that done. So maybe it's no harm we have time to think about it. And I think that there's a lot of negative dialogue around climate these days, but we need to focus on what we can do and the opportunities that we have, whether it's even in your own home, with your own car, or these larger scale opportunities. There is lots of opportunity there for us to make a difference.
Okay. Well, just before I let you go, I've been asked to remind everybody that you're invited for a drinks reception in the Trade Marquee at 6 o'clock, which is now, after the conference, and you're going to get local beer and cocktails with a difference. They don't explain that, mind you. At 7:30, an amazing experience, we're told, everybody back here in the Atlantic Theatre, a seafood extravaganza celebrating Bord Iascaigh Taste the Atlantic, and also celebrating the strong relationships between the European Union, Canada and the USA, so don't miss it. I just want to thank our panel very much. Niall McDonough had said that he wanted to say a few words, but I don't see him here, so I presume I've said those words for him. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all back here at 7:30.